Hello, and welcome to the fourth episode of Nemertes' Emerging Technologies Research Study webinar series. Today, we'll be focusing on frontier technologies, including Fintech. I'm John Burke, Nemertes' CTO. If you haven't already, I encourage you to view episodes 1 through 3, which are available on Bright Talk and via the Nemertes website. Please, as we go along, submit any questions that you have when they occur to you via the Bright Talk Q&A panel, and I'll either jump right on them at the moment that they're put up, or I will answer them during the Q&A session at the end. And with that, let's dive in. What would we be without slides? Let's show some slides. Oops. Let's show the right slide. There we go. We'll start here at the beginning. There we go. So, trends in frontier tech and Fintech. Normally, Jerry Murphy would be presenting, but today, I, John Burke, CTO at Nemertes, am doing the presenting. And we conducted a research study interviewing folks at about 20 companies, many of them financial firms, and hence the Fintech portion of this research, across 10 industries and medium-sized companies on average, with the goal of understanding how they are adopting, deploying, and getting value from a variety of bellwether technologies. And it's been across a really broad swath of areas of technology, and hence the series of webinars that we've been doing on it. As I said earlier, this is number 4, and actually 2 more coming after this one. So when we're looking at frontier technology, we're looking at things that are really on the leading edge of the leading edge at most organizations, or even things that are just on a distant planning horizon, if at all, for most organizations. So things like quantum technologies, cobots, digital twinning, varying degrees of adoption across companies, but fairly new tech for most. And by fintech, we're talking about finance-focused technologies that are not conventional back-end systems for doing online banking or the like. So this is including things like decentralized financial services automation, and use of things like digital assets or EFTs or the like. And when we say bellwether, we're looking at a sampling of the technologies in a given space. So we're not trying to exhaustively catalog every technology in the space and find out how people are doing and adopting it. We're looking at specific technologies or practices that we see as indicators of the maturity of an organization in its approach to a given technology area. Again, it's not comprehensive, but it is a good way of assessing a company's sophistication in its approach to these areas of technology. Hence, we look not just at whether or not folks are using the technology and whether or not they're getting value from it, those first couple of criteria there, but also at a lot of organizational and operational aspects of their use of the technology. Do they have folks focused on it? Do they have defined use cases, metrics, KPIs, governance, etc.? And lastly, we're also looking at whether they have fit the technology space into their planning and architecture functions. Do they have roadmaps? Do they have strategies? Do they have architectures? Not just for the technology itself, but also for making it a part of the overall IT environment and IT roadmap strategy and architecture. And what we've seen is that there's a real spread across these technologies that we've grouped together as frontier tech, some of them much more broadly adopted than others. And that in many cases, folks have done some evaluation or are in the process of evaluating, but are not yet seeing the use cases that they'll find compelling. Quantum computing is a great example of that. most people seem to think it's going to be very big and even big for them, but they don't yet have in mind for their business what the killer app for it will be for them. Cobots, another one where folks are ready to embrace them and starting to see use cases that might apply to them because there are enough early adopters out there to kind of show the way. We see, and it's not shocking, that a lot of classical banking is under serious stress from the fintech space and the need to either adopt it or respond to it in some way. That some of the lag is on the front of security and established financial services firms being especially sensitive to compromising their security in any way, even if it means getting into a new game, technologically speaking, and a compelling one even. And we see some pretty strong split in the space between folks who are very up on digital currencies and NFTs and things like that, and folks who neither know nor care to get any more deeply into them than they are, which is not at all. So in looking at this, and in looking at the broad array of organizational traits and organizational practices that go along with the technology's adoption, we're trying to basically map companies and the market overall onto our maturity model, which runs through 4 levels from unprepared through anticipatory. When somebody's unprepared, in our maturity model, when somebody's unprepared, they just don't have what they need to take effective action in that given domain of technology. They don't have the data that they need, they don't have the systems that they need, and will either be unaware of or unable to respond effectively to current or emerging issues in that space. At the next level, where folks are in a sort of reactive posture, they have the basic structures and platforms in place, they can react effectively, but they're not looking ahead on the curve at all, and they don't really have everything they need to do that, which leads us to the proactive level, where you've got all the stuff you need to proactively address things that can happen right now, and you don't have to wait and get hit by the guy with the bat in the dark. You're aware of his potential existence and taking steps already. But then there's the anticipatory level beyond that, where you're also prepared to deal with, what we classically call the unknown unknowns, the things that you're not aware can even possibly happen, but you're well positioned to respond to them when they become a possibility. And what we've seen is that overall, folks are on the fintech side, mostly in the unprepared and reactive level of existence, and very few of them at the proactive and anticipatory level. With frontier technology, the broader bucket, about 2/3 are in a reactive mode there. They're responding to things as they pop up, and just a few are at that anticipatory level, where they're well out in advance of what's actually obtruding into their company's space at the moment. So digging in a bit, in frontier tech, we group together these bellwethers, things related to quantum computing, quantum cryptography, and quantum as a service, also enterprise NFTs, use of augmented reality, virtual reality, and digital twinning technologies, use of cobots, and adoption of distributed autonomous organizations, which is an interesting and not in itself, not a technology-focused technology, if you will. We'll talk more about that in a second. For more detail on folks' adoption in this space, we're seeing that where folks are furthest ahead of the curve is on is on the organizational side of things. They're positioning themselves to deal with these new technologies as they become relevant to them, but for the most part have not actually deployed the technologies, are not doing anything with them, and not therefore deriving a lot of actual value from them. And in looking at it, one of our participants drew a lot of attention or focus onto the network, saying that lots of the things that they want to do at the cutting edge of technology are essentially all of them are network mediated, and dealing with protecting network access has become a critical underlying skill and technology focus for them. And another has said that things like quantum and digital twinning are going to be very important for them because of the sector that they're in. They're a federal and defense contractor, and their clients are very focused on these things. Now, quantum computing is a pretty interesting one because people are very clear on the value they expect to get from it, and that they expect that to be, quantifiable and consistent. But none of them are actually deploying it yet. Lots of folks in the evaluation phase, they're just not seeing what for them in their business the killer app is going to be, or even if they can imagine how they might use it, they're not yet seeing the platforms that they need commercially available to exploit it, let alone having the skills available to exploit it in-house. And related to that, in name mainly and not in technological underpinnings, is quantum cryptography, which is a misnomer and a fairly significant one, because it's not about using quantum computing to do your encryption and decryption or anything like that. It's about using quantum principles of light particles for communications to communicate cryptography keys. So basically, quantum cryptography is really better named quantum key distribution. And again, people are very clear on what the value of that could be, sort of tamper evident or even eavesdropping evident ability to distribute private cryptographic keys across your network. But they're still evaluating and not deploying, and in part that's because of this ongoing confusion about what it actually means, and in part that's because of the significant limitations that apply to it currently. And those are mainly limitations of distance, but also some around the channel used to communicate the keys in the first place. So quantum cryptography, a little distant in terms of realizing the value. Quantum as a service. This is something where folks are taking generally quantum cryptography and delivering it as a service to an enterprise so that they provide the infrastructure necessary for doing the distribution of quantum cryptography keys. Right, the quantum distribution of cryptography keys. Word order is very important on that one. And again, lots of folks not considering it, not even really knowing whether anybody in their company is considering it, just a third saying that they're evaluating things and expecting to get real value out of it when it's ready for prime time, but not yet at the point where they're even doing a proof of concept deployment. And 2/3 of folks saying they don't know if there's going to be any value to it, which we think is a really solid position to stand in right now, because especially for quantum as a service, it's possible for the as a service part to actually render some of the potential benefits of quantum key distribution moot for the service consumer. And so we think there's a lot of justifiable caution there. Now, looking at NFTs, that's a non-monetary application of blockchain technologies for, excuse me, for creating unique digital entities and tracking their provenance. We see, just a third of folks evaluating it. More than that, saying we understand what the value of it would be, and clearly, though, not seeing any place where they're likely to apply it in their own organizations yet. So they expect that there's going to be a lot of value there to be realized, but they don't see what the killer app is for their business or their industry even, let alone broad, non-vertical specific use cases. Now with VR and AR, we see a lot of folks evaluating, and that includes some who are in a proof of concept phase where they're potentially ready to deploy it, but they've got to prove it out in a use case on premises before they can. We see that across multiple industries where folks are doing these evaluations based on the specific needs of their business, be it for AR-assisted collaborative design or virtual reality collaborative design projects, AR assistance in training, the kind of thing where you can superimpose a schematic over the machine that somebody's looking at so that they can understand what all the pieces mean and do for them. And in a similar sense, or in a similar vein, AR-assisted field maintenance, where somebody who's gone off to fix a machine may not be super familiar with it and can get live tutorials or an expert hanging over their shoulder and overlaying stuff on their visual field to help them understand what they're supposed to be doing or directing them. We expect a significant number of these folks will commit to doing this in production. When we follow up this research next year, we'll find out. Related to that in some ways is the rise of digital twinning, where we see already a third of companies using it now in some capacity, and that we expect that to increase steadily as all the technologies that underpin it, which is basically compute, storage, and networking and analytics, have become more accessible either via cloud services or via considerably denser and faster infrastructures and data centers to handle the load, because it's typically a pretty heavy compute load, large memory models for things, and intense analytics to understand and predict the effect of actions on the digital twin. And of course, that's one of the big uses for digital twinning, is to experiment on something without having to actually experiment on the physical object. And so we see digital twinning used in everything from aircraft design and engineering to medicine and pharmaceutical research. And what you're creating a digital twin of varies dramatically across businesses, but the underlying concepts remain constant. And cobots is another core technology that has lots of use cases, already across different industries, and an increasing number of them as the sophistication of the robots continues to increase and as the cost of acquiring and operating them decreases. And the idea with a cobot is that it's a robot that provides intelligent assistance to a human operator. And that could be in the form of, your cobot coworker on the side who hands you the tool you need as you work on repairing things, or hands you the piece you need to insert into the assembly you're doing, if it's an assembly that the robots themselves can't do. Or could be something like a burger flipping robot in a fast food restaurant that is able to do some of the work with only an indication of what it should do next. So you just tell it, flip that one, and it knows how to go through the motions of flipping it. It's not that you are in real time in remote control mode, using a glove or something to mimic the motion of flipping the burger. You just indicate which ones are ready, and it does the flipping for you. And that's a real use case, not just one that I'm plucking out of the air. So we see a lot of use cases for cobots already. We see an increasing number of them as the robots become capable of doing different kinds of work in different kinds of environments for a lower price point and with a higher degree of reliability. And as the AI that has to go into supporting that also becomes more competent and more affordable. Now, DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations, are a really interesting technology in that they are an application of technology to organizational issues. The idea being that you can use the blockchain or a blockchain, you can use a blockchain to do things like give people a set of options they can choose among, like voting and recording contract terms and whether or not people have agreed to them, and setting up established principles for operating and then checking whether future actions are in accordance with those principles. The idea being that you can start to remove human hierarchy from some of these organizational challenges and use technology to mediate the self-organization of a group of people instead of people to mediate that. And it's a really fascinating concept. We're starting to see just a few really interesting bellwether companies trying to apply it to how they operate and application in other spaces, including voting, like voting for stockholders at an annual meeting, or other applications of voting in corporate context or in a community context. So something to keep an eye on, something a lot of people aren't really aware of yet, but that could be applied across a broad spectrum of social and organizational issues in a way that eases operation and especially the scaling of operations from the very small to the very large. Now, looking across the places where organizations tell us they are in much better position relative to frontier technologies, all of the organizational operational maturity measures, they're looking better than on the technology side, with people pointed at adoption and understanding of frontier technologies and the development of defined use cases for them, the development of metrics and KPIs and defined governance, having budgeting for leading edge technology generically in the organization, rather than having to take each new technology as a special case, having a training framework set up to get the information needed to exploit new technologies into the hands of people who need it, and revising operations and strategies and roadmaps for IT overall, for integration of these new technologies into it. All of those organizations are either there or planning to be there or evaluating the technology. So again, a higher level of maturity in that sense. And it's pretty well summed up by this statement from one of the participants. We see a lot of potential that we are actively investigating. And another person pointing out that it's all very interesting, but still very emerging. We expect, therefore, to see a lot of these organizations make the sort of fish or cut bait evaluations on some of these technologies and dive into other ones as they make room on their agenda for evaluations. So before we dive into the fintech piece, which I will go through a little more quickly, let me just again urge people, if they haven't, to submit any questions that they've got. I see none in the panel right at the moment. Submit questions in the Q&A panel, and excuse me, I will answer them as they come up or in the Q&A at the end of the session. So in fintech, we were looking at digital assets, decentralized finance or DeFi, predictive analytics in financial applications, digital experience platforms, things like chatbots for use in financial services, and of course, financial services automation, and we'll see a kind of a broad spectrum of levels of adoption of those specific technologies. But as with frontier tech, a pretty high level of organizational maturity in all these spaces. And this is driven in part by fear, as that first comment points out. Financial services companies, traditional fintech, are under a lot of stress, and these next-gen DeFi type fintech firms are really putting fear into the old-fashioned bankers of the world. And it's mainly in the mid-size and smaller banks, because the big banks are well positioned to adopt these technologies in ways that dovetail nicely with what they're doing already. Smaller companies are less likely to have the resources to do that. So we see with digital assets that a small group are using such things now as business products, and are seeing value out of that, mostly some pretty real value, even if it's not entirely consistent. But everybody's seeing value from it, even if, like that 25% in the green slice, they're having a little trouble measuring it and quantifying what that value is. Decentralized finance, which is a much more radical thing in some ways than just going with the ability to use digital currencies in your financial services organization. Decentralized finance, again, small slice adopting currently, but most of everybody else not even considering it. And I guess that makes a lot of sense if you're a financial services company that's basically been in the business of being the centralized part of finance. It's a pretty radical shift to put yourself in the shoes of decentralized finance. On the other hand, 2/3 of organizations say they are already using pretty significant automation in their financial services service provision layer, and most of the rest are planning on deploying in the coming year, and the remainder are evaluating. And there's no question there, but that there's real, measurable, and consistently demonstrated value to having deeper automation and broader automation in the space. Now, on the organizational side, and it makes a lot of sense, folks have got teams focused on this already. If they've got any use cases, if they've got any interest, they've defined the use cases that make sense for them, and already understand the metrics that they'll need to be paying attention to determine whether they're going to get the value out of it that they desire. They have governance, or they are in the process of developing it right now. And money's there, training's there, and they're in the process, most of them, of figuring out how to revise their operations, processes, procedures, policies to incorporate the new technologies that they're deploying on the finance side. Most have a strategy in place for this, or will have one by the end of this year. And similarly, strategy for the technology itself and for integration of it, either have it already or will have it in the course of the year. Excuse me. So we see that the use cases are pretty well understood by some folks, at least. The challenges that they represent pretty well understood by some folks, at least, and that there are an enormous number of competitors in this space, putting a squeeze on those mid-sized organizations, that there are a huge number of ISVs doing work in fintech, and especially in DeFi, and that the large banks all have their operations in it as well. So overall, an area of enormous activity and possibility and ferment for folks in this space. Now, before we jump into that Q&A period, and let me again urge you to put questions in the Q&A panel, any that have occurred to you so far, I want to draw everybody's attention to the links in the Attachments tab of the BrightTalk interface. You can go there and use the links to connect with us via LinkedIn. You can use them to register for future episodes of this series, episodes 5 and 6 coming up over the next 2 weeks. And you can use link there to get to the application form to join Nemertes online community for enterprise IT professionals. It's for IT professionals, it's advertising free, and it's really a place where you can ask questions and expect informed answers either from your peers or from us, the analysts at Nemertes. Make jokes that people will understand, or just look for commiseration on IT specific woes and ailments of the spirit. So if that's something that's of interest, again, in the applications, in the attachments tab, you'll find a link to take you to the form, or you can see the URL there on the screen, nemertes.com/community. And that will, let me see, I'll leave this slide up actually while we go into questions. And right now I just have a couple. So how can quantum as a service undo the benefits of quantum cryptography? Great question. Quantum cryptography, which isn't quantum cryptography, but is in fact quantum key distribution, relies on a quantum channel existing between one end of the communication and the other. So if Alice is working with Bob to generate a key, they've got to be connected by a piece of fiber, and I'm pretty sure it has to be an unbroken piece of fiber. No boosters, no switches, no conversion to electronic, and then back to optical. An unbroken fiber link between the two people. And practically speaking, that link can't be more than, gosh, I think it's 100 kilometers right now. I'll have to double check the actual length limit, but it's not a huge length limit. So it's okay in a metro area, tougher internationally and cross continent. And some services basically don't have any way to get you around that. So they do generation of keys using the quantum link in their infrastructure and get it, from the closest pop to Alice to the closest pop to Bob using that quantum channel. But then they're relying on conventional communications for the last part of the journey. And that means that Alice and Bob don't actually get the full benefits of the quantum key distribution because, of course, they are not actually on the quantum endpoints. So that's the main way that we see it happening. And, as we saw earlier, a lot of folks are not sure what the value in quantum key distribution is, and that's a pretty valid position to be in because ultimately the value hype is about quantum keys. And of course, they are just digital keys like any other, and they are generated using a random number generator. And the supposition is that, or the implication is that using a quantum-based random number generation technology will give you a higher quality randomness than other methods of generating random numbers. And to the best of my knowledge, that hasn't been proved, let alone proved for any specific vendor's underlying quantum key generator. So there's that undercutting the idea of the true value of quantum key distribution as well, and something to watch out for. I've rambled a bit. Question 2, and folks, there's still time to submit questions. Why don't more companies see potential use cases for quantum computing? Okay. That is an interesting question, and basically it comes down to there need to be more actual use cases out there where somebody's applied quantum computing to practical business problems in whatever space. There are some out there, and they've been very ingenious, using a quantum annealing system, which is not a general purpose computer, using a quantum annealing system, for example, to figure out more efficient ways of painting cars. One of the European car manufacturers sponsored a contest basically for how to use quantum to solve their problem, and they got a solution, and it's impressive. But it's a very, very special case because these quantum annealing machines only are really applicable to certain class of problems, things that can be mapped onto the kind of problem they can solve. The more general purpose quantum computing, we're still seeing a lot of foundational work going on in building algorithms that take advantage of the quantumness, in building basically all of the underlying stack for developing quantum applications on top of. And we see some of that is very vertical specific. There are folks who are focused on, applying quantum in like pharmaceutical research, or applying quantum in healthcare analytics. But there's still a whole bunch of work to be done to really push that to the level of a commercially viable product that I could consume instead of helping develop. So that's why we think a lot of companies aren't seeing their potential use cases yet. It's just still slightly too early days, especially for the general purpose quantum computers. Okay, and that is the last question that we have in hand here. So let's just wrap it up. The recording of this webinar will be available in our Bright Talk channel shortly. If you have found it valuable, please share it with your colleagues, and please take a moment to rate it. It's very much appreciated, and it helps us develop our future content. If you haven't already, check out all those links on the attachments tab. And thank you. Thank you for taking the time to join us today and for your questions. And we look forward to seeing you, or seeing your questions at least, on the next episode. And with that, thank you and goodbye.